Hello everyone, today we read and comment the first chapter of the fourth book of Von Clausewitz, Vom Kriege. Name of the new book we begin to read today is The Combat, and the one of the chapter is Introduction. It's mostly introductory note that Von Clausewitz inserts here, and the text follows. Having in the foregoing book examined the subjects which may be regarded as the efficient elements of war, we shall now turn our attention to the combat as the real activity in warfare, which, by its physical and moral effects, embraces sometimes more simply, sometimes in a more complex manner, the object of the whole campaign. In this activity and in its effects, these elements must therefore reappear. The formation of the combat is tactical in its nature. We only glance at it here in a general way in order to get acquainted with it in its aspect as a whole. In practice, the minor or more immediate objects give every combat a characteristic form. These minor objects we shall not discuss until hereafter. But these peculiarities are, in comparison to the general characteristics of a combat, mostly only insignificant, so that most combats are very like one another, and therefore, in order to avoid repeating that which is general at every stage, we are compelled to look into it here before taking up the subject of its more special application. In the first place, therefore, we shall give the next chapter in a few words the characteristics of the modern battle in its tactical course, because that lies at the foundation of our conceptions of what the battle really is. So in this introductory chapter, von Clausewitz stresses the importance of combat in warfare as fundamentally the real activity of warfare proper, right? And he also highlights how, in spite of the difference that naturally exists within every combat that is never alike another one, there is still a general logic that lays under combat, and that it is important to analyze, especially after having listed in the previous book that we finished last time, the elements that deficient elements in war, right? So that is to say, you have your armed forces. Now let's see how they interact in combat, like how they struggle, and eventually observing other aspects that derive from it in the book proper, and that is to say how this combat is declined, what is the broader frame in which it's placed, and how it evolves given this asymptotic factors that we've seen now essentially are at the base of the Clausewitzian let's say view method, I would say, of analysis, but properly a view of the world, right? And in this range of extremes, right, where between which reality exists, within which reality exists. So it's very simple, but important to stress, because naturally it makes you understand how it doesn't just take, like this is a point that we've made since we have started Schwerpunkt, that is, military history cannot be simply seen as a series of tales, of stories that you have to know by heart, and therefore stressing in their diversity, right? Unless you're not making a point of course of saying how reality really can assume different forms. But the true point of warfare is combat in the fashion which this works basically in a universal sense, right? There is nothing that in the military logic cannot be brought down to a theory. That is what von Clausewitz here is drawing, in that is designed not to tell you exactly what will happen, but to be aware that what will happen in reality, as differently as it goes, it's still part of a range of possibilities that work within the frame of a mechanism, of a dynamic, we can say, more broad. And much of military historical awareness derives properly from the knowledge of this dynamic, the realization of doesn't matter how a reality can change, but still there is something at the base of it, at the core of it, that fundamentally produces, in fact, events as they go, in fact, for real, And that therefore, and this is the goal of the Vom Kriege, there's a theory art of war that, albeit theoretical, is not abstract. It's not like merely, like you should know what theoretically this is on paper, and then real war is like a whole different matter. You don't need books to understand it. Well, this is actually wrong, because von Clausewitz himself makes the point that war is much better learned in reality for the sake of understanding it. I mean, in combat, in commanding, actually, more than else, than on history books. The two things are complementary, but that especially, there is not, it's impossible at this point in history to the level of complexity of our society to address war as if, there wasn't properly a theory behind that. You must know it to understand it, to actually carry it out, to command. That may not need that as a primary thing, because von Clausewitz teaches us how command is the most direct form of learning, but still it must be disciplined in a way for which otherwise we wouldn't train officers in military academies, because why doing that, right? Instead, there is a very important theoretical compartment that has nothing to do with theoretical speculations, but with proper reality, so much that the theory of the art of war, as we have seen in Vom Kriege, is essentially built on military history proper, right? Because it doesn't matter whether this stems from the commanding experience or from history books that von Clausewitz had massively in both cases, by the way, but still it can be employed positively to have a great result. And we've seen, paradoxically, this positivity stems exactly from the denial of a positivistic approach to reality in general, and to war in that sense, because most of what happens in warfare cannot be predicted in the measure in which it actually happened. So that the point of staying there for real, like in position of command, is simply testing the unpredictability of the system, so that you can be aware of it to react. But of course you need a theoretical backbone that can make you understand better, more orderly, more clearly, something that took actually millennia of civilization to reach up to von Clausewitz, and that was in a sense a natural consequence even of the political, social, military developments of all these years, and that, however, now it's needed for the sake of actual real positive accomplishment of the conduct of war, right? And von Clausewitz, in fact, here points out the character of modern battle, as we explained actually in the last chapter of the third book, not because he's pretending that war now has, in his own time, talking about the Napoleonic era essentially and its immediate, the following decades, is, the top, like, this is a kind of war that has reached like a level of unchangeability, and that therefore we should be learning it just on the base of, this essentially this European 19th century perspective. Not at all, right? We have explained this in the last chapter. This has nothing to do with von Clausewitz pretending to lecture us about 19th century warfare, but telling us true historical examples, including the Napoleonic wars that were by far one of the best, in fact, the best example properly, in at least in quantitative terms, of what war really is, and how it works mechanically, right? So meet all those people that pretend that von Clausewitz is telling you that, warfare is just like in the 19th century, and pretending that there's just someone today that has to tell us instead how it's in the 21st, has not understood basically nothing about the Vom Kriege, has properly neither read it. I would say, simply as that, because von Clausewitz makes it pretty clear that what he understands as a modern battle is something that basically stems from a degree of awareness, not from the fact that warfare cannot change in that regard, and that the whole task of the Vom Kriege is exactly showing how warfare, in fact, never changes, how the core, the essential dynamic of warfare, and how the efficient elements of war interact with each other are within the range of extremes, actually the same throughout all human history, and there is nothing can be attributed to a specific time in military history. Actually, the Vom Kriege goes as far as saying, as in entailing mainly that warfare, albeit properly emerged from a certain point onwards in human history, or better, in prehistory, because warfare today is, now we should make another video actually to tell what is that, when we can start talking about war, about armies, about something that we can study in that sense. But actually, I think that's not, that's a very fascinating question overall, but it's not really the point of the Vom Kriege as such, because the Vom Kriege is shifting the attention towards the single most important element of this, that there are the driving factors in the physical elements of war, right, and how they interact. And as we've seen, war in the Clausewitzian theory can be exchanged fundamentally, even for violence, to tell it all, right? At the very beginning of the Vom Kriege, you see, that war is basically a duel on a large scale. So here it doesn't even entail properly a specific political and social stage of development or level of military organization. This is something that lays deep at the roots of humanity, and that always stems from conflict, from this primordial enmity and instinct, and it breaks out as in the form of violence that is properly the object of studying the Vom Kriege. That is also against culturalism to say, it's not, von Clausewitz is denying that there is a background for this, that culture history is not important. Ask him and all the military history back up to the ancient times that he studied thoroughly in a way that probably people who criticize him have neither done, and that this is not important because he would have not at that point written a book to repeat the world military history, interpret it better, which he also wrote about, by the way. But the Vom Kriege is aimed at making you understand that in spite of all the differences that he constantly declares are out there, there is this essential core, this immanent condition, right, that of human nature that takes form eventually in violence, in the ways he studies it, with the interaction, with the dynamics that takes place in here. So we have in other videos explained better at this point, but it's really crucial, because I think that the Vom Kriege in this sense is way more actual than ever. Like, there is not even a single episode in history up to today that cannot be understood, that there is not frameable or interpretable through the Clausewitzian theory, right? Every single thing that happens everywhere in the world in military terms is something that it's clearly stated in Vom Kriege. It's clearly described, it's clearly drawn, it's clearly understood in the Vom Kriege. And this is really powerful. And the only reasons why there are people out there who do not accept this is that, one, they haven't studied the Vom Kriege, second, they don't understand anything about military history. Even people who pretend they're actually making a point about it, there is no pride in being able to tell a story of war. The only pride is having properly a military logic that explains you why something happens on the base of sources of evidence, right, through a history, right, and that is capable of, interpreting it through the paradigms that the Clausewitzian theory entails. And I can tell you that, like, a good 95% of whichever thing you read, doesn't matter from which source it comes from. This is not even a problem, don't think that, civil or military, amatorial or professional, stated is, like, with maybe a favor towards the latter categories, is basically useless in strictly intellectual terms. In order to understand war, is something that doesn't get the point of what the whole thing is. And this actually could easily be told about every other single field of knowledge out here, right? That it's very easy to talk about things, it's very easy to point out stuff, collect data, etc. But at a certain point you have to frame this, you have to analyze it, you have to understand it. It's enormously difficult. Von Clausewitz does it for you in an aseptic way so that you can basically apply it to the world where I say, no, this is not good because, I don't know, I presume that von Clausewitz is talking just about Napoleonic here. Why? And that is making it a model just, for the world history. Why? Have you even read the thing? And the answer most of the time is not, right? And it's extremely easy to understand if a person has ever even just read. Like, I don't want to go as far as studying, which is the only thing you should do with this book, because this book is not to be read. This is not a book you can cherry pick quotes from and pretend you have understood the thing. If you read it, that's the difference, unfortunately, between history and telling stories. That, everybody can read a book and repeat what is in it. It takes studying to actually understand what it's written on, and that's the reason why there is a structural education that is aimed at achieving that, right? So the fact we're literate, the fact we read, has often nothing to do, actually, with understanding or being intelligent about the things we read or being capable of getting to the point with that. But in any case, this is just one of my usual rambles that I think are necessary because, as I was saying before, this work is important because it has a practical benefit, right? Whoever does not understand the practical utility of this work belongs to the category that we have just criticized. Right, I will make probably at some point a video dedicated to major criticism to von Clausewitz, even just at quoting other alleged experts, or at least the leading the leading figures that have criticized historiography, just as a theory von Clausewitz, the Clausewitzian one, and explain why. The fact that there's been all this misunderstanding, which factually does not exist, because all of our military is based on the Clausewitzian theory still today. So the rest is just a pathetic attempt to say to act as a prima donna and say, look, I have surpassed von Clausewitz because I'm more intelligent, because I live in the 20th century, I live in the 21st century. No, you haven't, and that's exactly the point of the Vom Kriege. That's not what that work is about. That is not to leave any room for much further discussion in the terms of whether warfare concretely works like, unless you don't actually prove that you're able to develop it on a systemic base, and the one von Clausewitz has created, and not just pretending to create exceptions about things that do not fit even in the system you're criticizing, because it's gone past beyond them, and in a very practical sense. Von Clausewitz writes, book for the combat, right? So here we address properly, as von Clausewitz points out, what war is about, right? Because violence effectively does not exist until combat breaks out proper, right? And the rest, naturally, the preparation for it is of enormous importance, as you understand, but that's, as we've seen actually in the last chapter, von Clausewitz says something, I'm paraphrasing now, but saying properly, if war was unrestrained from itself, talking about the absolute warfare that never existed and cannot exist by definition in our physical reality, what the thing would be the instant, combat, the pure violence in itself, right? We were talking about that in the context of the suspension of the act in the military, in the military conduct. I mean, in the fact that most of war is actually constituted not by combat at all. Like a good 90% is simply idling, and the reason being naturally that there are factors that dilute fundamentally the violence should be unleashed for achieving the political purpose that you're up to by starting the war, right? And von Clausewitz states, properly, what truly matters in warfare is exactly all what is aimed to combat in this regard, right? That whole thing, after all, is done not for, fooling around, but properly for going out there and crushing the enemy, and obliging him to compel him to fulfill your will, right? So this is particularly important because it makes you understand that combat is fundamentally what the whole war fundamentally is about, right? Because even maneuvering and all that entails the the preparation to warfare is not even war by definition, if not in the intentions and naturally in the in the expectation of what will happen. So that strategy naturally is detached from combat by definition, because that pertains exclusively to tactics. But it's obvious that that's exactly the point, that strategy basically works to determine when and how the combat and where the combat is gonna take place, right? In order to make the combat the resolution of the whole thing, or better, the sum of the various combats, because it's, as we've seen, it's very difficult to say whether a combat is really decisive, right? The idea of the decisivity of a battle is a very controversial thing. It's often used in a kind of mostly in a sensationalistic thing, saying that I don't know, Tobruk or Stalingrad or Midway were, the decisive battles of the respectively of the African, the Eastern, and the Pacific front in World War II. But if you really look at the thing, it's not that they actually were the engagements that decided the fate of the war. For the African theater, it's already a big deal if the Axis could hope to win in the first place. By the time Stalingrad was over, the Nazis had basically lost the war from the year before, right? Barbarossa failed in the autumn of November 1941, right? You don't have to wait for Stalingrad to say that front was messed up. Midway, was there ever a chance for Japan to defeat the United States in the Pacific, without the help of its allies in the first? No, right? So what is decisive? What is decisive, and how do we know that the tides could not be reverted at some point in other ways? Because the worst can always happen from both sides, and even if something more or less likely doesn't, there's nothing that really justifies the absolute definition of decisiveness for something that objectively could have even just even if it had been gone in a different way, I mean, the outcome had been different, may not have changed the ultimate outcome of the war, right? So the thing is extremely controversial, and even in here, the point we were doing, though, is that fundamentally the thing it gets down to is properly the combat in itself. That is, even in the first place, the reason why we're able to say whether a battle was important or influential for the rest of the war is properly the fact that it was fought, right? And it seems banal, but this is where von Clausewitz is going here, because all what strategically brought to that battle was objectively aimed at achieving, if not that battle, but combat at the very end. So this is a very important fluidification and clarification of what warfare is really all about, right? It's not a fetishistic taste for combat experience as such. The face of battle, as King puts that. It's very fascinating, of course, and it's in fact what really catches more our attention. We know that the campaign overall and even the political reasons stand behind it are way more important, and that is what you should properly understand for understanding the war in the first place. But if you want to understand the theory of the art of war, that is what brings effectively those armed forces to conflict in the way to fight in the way they do, right, is understanding that their aim is combat, that the whole thing that the entire thing revolves around is exclusively combat, because there is no war without combat and without violence. By definition, you could go as far from Clausewitz saying that they are actually the same thing, right? There is no war without combat. There is no combat without violence, right? And there is probably no war without violence. There is no, properly, even in here, the violence is assumed to be, even also in potential, right? The fact that you are repressing, you think about deterrence, but also the same fact as we have seen in strategy that we, even the fights the combats, the battles that do not take place have actually a strategic weight. That is to say, if you imagine that you will go into a battle that you may lose, you will say hell no, and you will act strategically accordingly. You will go in another, you will try to give battle in another circumstance, right? So the whole thing that really decides this all is the combat, as whether in anticipation of or properly during the fight, and this is the most important thing we should be taking into consideration. And von Clausewitz, in fact, writes, having in the foregoing book examined the subjects which may be regarded as deficient elements of war, we shall now turn our attention to the combat as the real activity in warfare, which by its physical and moral effects embraces sometimes more simply, sometimes in a more complex manner, the object of the whole campaign, right? And consider here the stress on the physical and moral effects. That is to say that the combat has an immense impact on how, even after it's consumed on the rest of the campaign, right? There is properly, as we have seen, a moment to which the outcome of the single combats is absorbed, is fundamentally, I can't find a proper term, but let's say it's received by strategy that eventually, and there's probably a moment in which the tactical dimension disappears, but because combat is over, and the troops have regrouped and can be disposed of once again by their commanders, they turn into a strategical dimension once again until the new combat is lightened up, right? But naturally, what the combat has produced once has a great impact on the whole vision of what of the campaign will be, right? This is particularly evident and important outside of the same military dimension, right? Because for the sake of the theory of the art of war, as we have seen, there is basically no true consequence that tactics has on strategy. In fact, for the disposition of your army, for employment of your armed forces. If your troops are shattered, if they're reorganized, resupplied, they're ready for the next fight. But properly, there is not, outside of the theory of the art of war, the consequence of that battle have had a political and social impact that are interfering even with the motivations of why this war is kept being fought, right? And that's in fact what even the even the idea of the decisivity of a battle, for example, is mistaken as in merely military terms, right? Whereas the whole point is also political and social, so that the campaign itself doesn't tell you with all the various unpredictable combinations that can turn up with what will it really lead to, but the intensity with that action will be carried out is not much about military matter, because the military matter simply tells you how mechanically the things should work, but the effort that should be able to put in there is something that derives from aspects that have to do with as we have seen, the ability of command, the military virtue of an army, but these, as we've seen, are always connected with a pre-existing reality, right? That is, let's say, pre-existing in the sense that it always interferes with the military one, right? Politics can cut this off at any moment, right? The military in this sense has no autonomy whatsoever, because whatever things happen in a campaign, politics can always decide whether it can stop at every second, right? And that's that's why the mere military dimension, that absolute warfare, right, the total war, that von Clausewitz speaks of is unattainable in reality. And if you want to get to the point, that also partly why the Nazis failed during World War II, because just for helping von Clausewitz with that garbage idea that he triggered things like National Socialism or other idiocy, aside from the fact that von Clausewitz was received much more effectively, for example, in the communist world, in the communist strategic culture than in others. The Nazis believed the total war was a real thing, right? That they could be achieved. That was this absolute. That, of course, from a moral point of view, it's a tendency towards that. It's obvious that Nazi Germany almost took over the entire world because of this tendency to the absolute, but still, it didn't. And the reason it didn't is that evidently this extreme was much more an ideal, and they simply got bogged down by on the Eastern Front for things that range from having underestimated simply the number of Soviet divisions, or having outstretched too much their supply lines, and that have nothing to do with the total war that by 1943, when the Germany had already basically lost the war, it was asked to the German population to continue the war till the end for the madness of that regime. But the point here we are making is that combat has kind of a shattering impact naturally on the psychophysical element, right, of who leads the war, right? And that's why also it's so dramatically important. That's why von Clausewitz says the object of it's a wall. It can arrive to embrace the object of the wall campaign, right? Because in practice, it tends towards that, right? It's fundamentally about that. As we've seen, politics can interfere, can reduce that wall that is never reached. But fundamentally, the sake for which war, again, is fought is to be fought, right? Otherwise, there wouldn't be war, right? And this is interesting because that's properly what happens when wars are over and how they end. I mean, the fact that there is a stage in which that there's still armed forces that act in some ways, but until they're not employed properly to fight, there's probably not even war, right? Even how do you think a war ends? Like there is, it's a diplomatic thing that someone writes that what is the last war that someone signed at the end of, right? Pretty far away, like in the 60s, something like that. The point is that the reality is very different, that things go on, that reactivate on the base of some dimension that are some dimension that is not to be controlled by, in fact, the military element, but it constantly reactivates according to whatever political reason there is out there, and that make the reason between some armies retreating to their own country and or others invading others, and what lays in the middle is after all very thin, and it probably doesn't exist because there's not properly a dimension of war and a dimension of peace. As we have seen, war is just an instrument of policy, nothing else, right? So it's not a dimension, it's an instrument, it's an action fundamentally, right? And even if, as we've seen, in theoretical terms, war has its own domain, well, this domain is always subordinated to politics, de facto. And von Clausewitz says, in this activity and its effects, these elements must therefore reappear. So, von Clausewitz is saying, these efficient elements of war that are the protagonists of combat will be analyzed further in this chapter. So, and then he writes, the formation of the combat is tactical in its nature, We only glance at it here in a general way in order to get acquainted with it in its aspect as a whole, right? So naturally, combat, as we've seen, pertains to tactics in its actual nature, hence in its application, concrete application. In practice, the minor or more immediate objects give every combat a characteristic form. So, as we've seen before, every combat is different, right? But it is so in the virtue of or minor or more immediate objects. Right? That is to say, this has to do with the concept of absolute war, is that this immediacy and minor elements are properly, part of a hierarchical scale, so that if we rose from them, we would get to the absolute of war. In an ideal sense, in an abstract sense, right? In that a physical sense that does not exist, and that therefore changes according to these circumstances that delay the military action per se. And he says these minor objects we shall not discuss until hereafter, that is to say, we will have to look at them later, right? He says, but these peculiarities are in comparison to the general characteristics of a combat mostly only insignificant, so that most combats are very like one another, and therefore, in order to avoid repeating that which is generally at every stage, we are compelled to look into it here before taking up the subject of its more special application. That is to say, as we were saying before, before starting to talk about things that pertain fundamentally to the contingency of reality, we should understand what combat is in itself, right? And objectivizing the fact that it doesn't matter how much the circumstances differ, that at the end of the day, combat is a unique activity that is basically always the same, right? And therefore, we must first address this, which happens in the next chapters. And von Clausewitz concludes by writing, in the first place, therefore, we shall give it in the next chapter, in fact, in a few words, the characteristic of modern battle in its tactical course, because that lies at the foundation of our conceptions of what the battle really is. Right. So that's a very interesting read we'll do next time. But for now, I hope that these concepts are clear, right? Because they're actually very simple. And we will spend, the rest of the Vom Kriege talking about them. But always bearing in mind, very, very concretely, that the first and most important aim, I think, of anyone in every field of knowledge, is to realize that there is a pattern of interpretation that can work, right? And that after all, our most intense exercise is exactly aimed at it. And we have no certainty of getting it right, but there is a clarity of vision that can help us better than not, right? Saying von Clausewitz, at a certain point in Vom Kriege says, here we are, as you know, he died before he could complete the work, and he was aware of it. So he wrote something like, we hope, I think we got this thing right. It's actually very moving, because we don't actually have the dating of this, these statements, but he was about to die, and he knew that in advance. So what he left written was exactly this. That is, I'm sorry I didn't finish this, but I want to let you know that what I've written here, I think I got it right? And that I hope that will be someone, that in the future that will, hopefully do better than what I've done, but that for now, he's modest there, but the meaning is actually that he really got it right in a way that nobody had done before, that still nobody has done ever since. And there is all a philological dimension in the Vom Kriege that is quite important. So starting from the fact that the first book is the only one that is finished, for example. But objectively, as we have seen up to now, this whole thing is very easy to read, right? It's very concrete and very fluid and clear and actually astonishingly crystalline and effective in everything and coherent in everything it's talking about. So this is definitely worth not just the awareness of a more extended amount of people, but also the realization that this work, whatever is being written like, really contains a degree of truthfulness in the simple way it's been formulated, that derives from years and years of military experience, military historical studies, and especially the most important factor of all, that is the moral pressure that this entailed, right? The fact that this person found himself into that mess to tell us, in the most objective ways possible, what is that we should be mindful in that condition. And he was a general, so he really had to take those decisions. Like, it was not like an individual soldier that in popular culture we tend to sympathize more with, because we assume that just the soldier fully understands what war is. Actually not. It's really mostly the generals that truly understand what war is, right? The myth of, unfortunately, the scars of World War I have produced this lunacy of the idea that the generals just a bunch of murderers, psychos and murderers that do not know what to do, and the poor soldier is just the one that got in the general's place would get it all better, right? This is utter garbage, like at the most exponential value, because it's really the other way around. It's the reason why we have a hierarchy, first of all, that we have ranks. That's why we have a higher military education in the first place, based even on works of the same von Clausewitz that showed us how it is the case that who looks from the above has the greater understanding and the greater moral burden, by the way, to do what they do. This is also another topic, but this is also, like, if you disagree with this point, I don't know what to tell you. Like, probably get out of here, but given that we are saying all this stuff, but more, sincerely, like, try to just to understand better the Vom Kriege, right? Try to make the effort of literally understanding it, because as we were saying before, this is not a matter of reading the work. It's not a matter of having a personal opinion about it. It's about studying it, and if possible in the original language, or at least with a decent translation. Here we started the Vom Kriege, the series using the Graham translation, which is not a big deal. It's very old. It's actually the worst, possibly, but I always read it in two other languages rather than English before I start this. And after all, there are certain mistakes we pointed out, but generally speaking, the concepts here have to. This is a disclosure, right? So this does not mean that we are not analyzing, in fact, literally every single passage of the Vom Kriege, but that there is a general mindset that you have to start developing while studying this work, right? It's not about as we were saying before, the evaluation of a single concept. It's really about the understanding of a whole system that even with a missing part cannot work. And everything is written in this work is not starting out of nothing. It's literally a logical chain that you have to follow. Otherwise, you fundamentally will not understand what the whole thing really is. But anyhow, so we start the fourth book, and we stop it here. And for now, I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.